The sound of celebrating human soldiers drifted across the base as news of victory spread through the colony. After 8 days of continuous fighting, the Krex raiders had finally been driven off. The cost had been severe, with over 200 human casualties, but the colonists had held their ground against overwhelming odds. Veltar watched from the observation deck of Serenity's Hope as humans began the process of treating their wounded and assessing damage. What struck him most was how quickly the humans transitioned from combat operations to recovery activities. Soldiers who had been fighting desperately hours earlier were now organized into work details, clearing debris and establishing aid stations. Those with minor injuries continued working alongside their uninjured comrades as though bleeding wounds were simply another inconvenience to manage. Dr. Grant had not left the medical facility since the fighting began. For 18 straight hours, she had treated an endless stream of casualties, using techniques that continued to traumatize any Zephyrian who observed them. Yet she moved through the post-battle medical assessments with the same calm efficiency she had shown throughout the crisis. Her hands remained steady, and her judgment appeared unimpaired despite exhaustion that would have incapacitated most galactic species. Veltar decided to visit the human medical facility one final time before departing. His team was still recovering from their psychological trauma, but he felt compelled to understand what he had witnessed. The scenes that had broken his colleagues' minds represented normal behavior for humans, and he needed to comprehend how such resilience was possible. The medical facility was quieter now, but still busy with follow-up treatments and recovery assessments. Soldiers who had undergone major surgery days earlier were already moving around helping with lighter duties. Private Danny Foster sat in a wheelchair learning to use prosthetic attachments for his amputated leg. Instead of displaying the depression and social withdrawal that would be normal for any other species, Foster was enthusiastically planning his return to active duty and support roles. Sergeant Alex Carter, whose initial treatment had so shocked the Zephyrian observers, was sitting up in bed reviewing tactical reports. The massive shrapnel wounds in his chest and abdomen were healing through the slow tissue replacement process that Dr. Grant had explained. His reconstructed arm remained immobilized, but Carter was already discussing physical therapy schedules and projected return dates for field operations. Veltar approached Dr. Grant as she completed her rounds. She looked tired but satisfied with the results of her work. Of the 237 casualties brought to her facility, only 12 had died, and most of those from injuries so severe that even Zephyrian regenerative medicine might have failed. The survival rate was remarkable considering the primitive techniques and hostile conditions. Dr. Grant welcomed Veltar and offered to answer any remaining questions he might have. She seemed genuinely interested in Zephyrian healing methods and asked about the possibility of future medical cooperation between their species. Her casual attitude toward the traumatic procedures he had witnessed demonstrated how completely normal such experiences were for humans. Veltar found himself struggling to express what his observations had taught him. He had come to New Terra, expecting to demonstrate superior medical technology to grateful primitive aliens. Instead, he had encountered a species whose relationship with injury and healing challenged fundamental assumptions about biology, consciousness, and survival. The humans had achieved something far more impressive than regenerative healing. Dr. Grant showed him the latest casualty reports and recovery projections. Soldiers who had been severely wounded during the early fighting were already requesting return to active duty. The human capacity to bounce back from injuries that would permanently disable other species was beyond anything in galactic medical literature. More importantly, they seemed to become more determined rather than more cautious after experiencing trauma. Commander Morrison joined them for a final briefing about the battle's outcome. He moved carefully due to the chest tube Dr. Grant had inserted during his emergency surgery but showed no signs of long-term impairment. Morrison expressed appreciation for Zephyrian medical observation and suggested that formal cooperation agreements might benefit both species. The discussion revealed that humans had been developing medical techniques for thousands of years based on the assumption that healing required conscious endurance of pain and trauma. Their entire approach to medicine was built around maintaining function during injury rather than shutting down for regenerative healing. The philosophical difference was so fundamental that translation between human and galactic medical concepts was nearly impossible. Veltar learned that human military doctrine actually incorporated severe injury as an expected part of operations. Battle plans included assumptions about casualty rates and medical evacuation requirements that would be considered unconscionably reckless by any other species. Yet humans achieved tactical objectives despite accepting levels of damage that would force other civilizations to withdraw from conflict entirely. The post-battle medical statistics were staggering when compared to galactic norms. Human soldiers had continued fighting effectively while suffering wounds that would immediately incapacitate members of any other known species. Squad leaders had made tactical decisions while undergoing emergency surgery. Combat medics had treated casualties while sustaining serious injuries themselves. Dr. Grant explained that such performance was considered normal rather than exceptional by human standards. Military training included preparation for operating while wounded and medical. Education emphasized treating conscious patients who remained aware throughout procedures. The entire system was designed around the assumption that humans would continue functioning despite catastrophic damage. As their conversation continued, Veltar realized that humans had not simply developed tolerance for pain and injury. They had created a civilization that transformed trauma into strength and used suffering as motivation for greater achievement. The concept was so alien that most galactic species would be unable to understand it, even with detailed explanation. The meeting concluded with formal agreements for future medical cooperation between human and Zephyrian healers. Dr. Grant would lead a research team studying applications of regenerative healing techniques for human patients, while Veltar would establish protocols for treating humans using methods that acknowledged their unique physiology and psychology. Serenity's Hope, prepared to depart New Terra. Veltar composed his final report to the Galactic Medical Coalition. The document would require entirely new categories of analysis to describe what he had observed. Traditional medical classifications were inadequate for a species that treated catastrophic injury as routine occupational hazard rather than life-threatening emergency. The report's conclusion challenged everything the galactic medical community believed about healing and survival. Humans had achieved something far more valuable than regenerative capabilities. They had developed the psychological and physical resilience to function despite damage that would destroy other species. Their medicine did not simply heal injuries. It created warriors who could not be broken by pain trauma or the prospect of permanent disability. Veltar's final observation noted that humanity represented a fundamental challenge to galactic assumptions about civilization and progress. Most species achieved advancement by eliminating sources of trauma and developing technologies that prevented suffering. Humans had taken the opposite approach, using adversity as a tool for building strength and treating hardship as necessary preparation for greater challenges. The recommendation section suggested that the Galactic Medical Coalition establish specialized research facilities for studying human resilience and developing techniques that other species could use to build similar psychological durability. However, Veltar warned that direct application of human methods would likely prove impossible for beings who lacked humanity's evolutionary background and cultural conditioning. As the ship jumped to hyperspace, leaving New Terra behind, Veltar reflected on how completely his mission had been transformed. He had come to teach primitive aliens about proper medicine, and learned instead that some species do not just heal from trauma, they are forged by it into something stronger than any regenerative process could create. The humans had shown him that true healing sometimes meant accepting permanent scars as proof of survival, rather than evidence of medical failure. The medical bay aboard Serenity's Hope had been converted into a recovery ward for traumatized Zephyrian healers. Veltar lay in a bioregeneration pod trying to repair the psychological damage from witnessing human medical practices. His respiratory system had collapsed twice during the night, and his colleagues were in even worse condition. 3 junior healers remained in catatonic states while others experienced what human psychiatrists would classify as severe trauma responses. After 12 hours of intensive treatment, Veltar felt stable enough to demand answers. He contacted the human base and requested an immediate meeting with Dr. Grant. The questions burning in his mind could not wait for his team to fully recover. How had such a fragile species developed the capacity to endure procedures that would break the minds of advanced galactic civilizations? Dr. Grant arrived at Serenity's Hope accompanied by Commander Morrison. Both humans appeared tired but alert, despite having worked continuously through the night treating casualties. Veltar noticed that Dr. Grant moved with slight stiffness, suggesting she had sustained minor injuries during the recent fighting, yet she showed no signs of impairment or distress. The meeting took place in the ship's main conference room, with several recovering Zephyrian healers participating via remote connection. Veltar began by expressing his team's shock at human medical practices and demanding to know why such brutal techniques were considered acceptable. Dr. Grant looked genuinely puzzled by his distress. She explained that human medicine had developed over millions of years on a hostile planet, where regenerative healing was not an evolutionary option. Early humans who could not repair catastrophic damage quickly learned to function despite injuries or they died. Those who survived passed on genetic traits that favored pain tolerance and the ability to remain conscious during trauma. Commander Morrison activated a holographic display showing human evolutionary history. The images revealed a species that had developed in an environment filled with predators, diseases, and natural disasters. Unlike the peaceful garden worlds where most galactic species evolved, humans had faced constant threats that required immediate response, even when injured. Dr. Grant showed medical data comparing human physiology to other known species. Human nervous systems were designed to compartmentalize pain rather than shut down when damaged. Their cardiovascular systems could function at reduced capacity, even with significant blood loss. Most importantly, human brains could override survival instincts that would incapacitate other beings. The concept was difficult for Veltar to understand. Zephyrian evolution had favored regeneration over endurance. When injured, their bodies automatically entered healing trances while biological systems repaired damage. The idea of remaining conscious and functional during major trauma was completely outside their evolutionary experience. Dr. Grant accessed historical records showing human medical practices throughout their development. Ancient human warriors had continued fighting with spear wounds that penetrated vital organs. Medieval surgeons had performed amputations on conscious patients using primitive tools. Even early space colonists had endured emergency surgery in hostile environments without proper medical facilities. What disturbed Veltar most was learning that humans considered these examples inspirational rather than horrifying. Dr. Grant spoke with obvious pride about historical figures who had accomplished remarkable feats while severely injured. Commander Morrison shared stories of soldiers who had saved their units despite wounds that should have been immediately fatal. The humans showed footage from their recent conflicts that made the Zephyrian healers understand why their current medical techniques seemed routine. Soldiers regularly continued fighting with injuries that would require immediate evacuation for any other species. Squad leaders made tactical decisions while undergoing field surgery. Combat medics treated wounded while under direct enemy fire. Veltar asked about human psychological responses to such trauma. Dr. Grant explained that while humans did experience emotional distress from severe injuries, they had developed cultural mechanisms for processing pain that other species lacked. Soldiers viewed scars as symbols of survival rather than signs of biological failure. Veterans shared stories of their injuries as bonding experiences rather than traumatic memories. The revelation that humans actually celebrated permanent damage was shocking to Zephyrian sensibilities. In their culture, any injury that left lasting marks indicated failure of proper medical treatment. Scars were shameful reminders of incomplete healing. The human practice of treating such marks as badges of honor suggested a completely different relationship with physical damage. Commander Morrison explained human military culture, where surviving combat injuries increased rather than decreased social status. Wounded veterans were respected for their sacrifice and experience. Soldiers who returned to duty after severe injuries were considered heroes rather than damaged individuals. The concept inverted everything Zephyrians understood about injury recovery and social integration. Dr. Grant accessed psychological profiles showing how humans processed trauma differently than other species. While Zephyrians experienced system shutdown when faced with overwhelming injury, Humans often responded with increased determination and aggression. Pain could actually enhance rather than diminish human performance under certain circumstances. The medical data revealed that human stress hormones created chemical responses that other species would consider toxic. Adrenaline and endorphins allowed humans to function through injuries that would incapacitate beings with more sensitive nervous systems. These chemical reactions were so intense that other galactic species would require medical intervention to survive exposure to human stress response compounds. Veltar learned that human medical training actually involved deliberately exposing practitioners to traumatic situations to build tolerance. Dr. Grant had spent years learning to perform surgery while patients remained conscious and aware. She had been trained to work efficiently, despite blood loss equipment failures and hostile environments that would paralyze other species' healers. 2. Educational process included exposure to historical examples of extreme medical procedures performed under impossible conditions. Human medical students studied cases where surgeons had operated by candlelight during battles or performed amputations in Arctic conditions without proper instruments. These situations were taught as inspiration rather than warnings about inadequate medical practice. Commander Morrison shared intelligence reports about other human colonies that had faced similar crises. In every case, human survivors had endured injuries and medical treatments that galactic observers considered impossible. The pattern suggested that extreme trauma tolerance was not unique to this particular human population, but represented normal capabilities for the entire species. The most disturbing revelation came when Dr. Grant explained that human medicine was actually becoming more sophisticated and less traumatic over time. Current techniques represented the gentle end of human medical development. Historical practices had been far more brutal and primitive, yet humans had not only survived, but thrived under conditions that would have eliminated any other known species. Veltar finally understood why his team had experienced such severe psychological trauma. They had not simply witnessed primitive medical techniques performed by backward aliens. They had encountered a species that had evolved capabilities so far outside galactic norms that observing normal human behavior could literally drive other beings insane. The meeting concluded with Dr. Grant offering to share human medical knowledge with the Galactic Medical Coalition. She suggested that while direct application of human techniques would be impossible for other species, the underlying principles of trauma management might prove valuable. Commander Morrison added that humans would welcome the opportunity to learn about advanced regenerative healing from Zephyrian medicine. As the humans prepared to return to their base, Veltar realized that first contact protocols had completely failed to prepare anyone for encountering a species like humanity. The galaxy's medical establishment would need to develop entirely new categories of analysis to understand beings who treated catastrophic injury as routine occupational hazard, rather than medical emergency requiring immediate evacuation and intensive care. The night brought no relief from the constant stream of wounded humans. Veltar had managed to compose himself after several hours aboard Serenity's Hope, but his team remained deeply shaken by what they had witnessed. Against his better judgment, he decided they needed to return to the human medical facility to gather more data for their report to the Galactic Medical Coalition. The scene that greeted them was even more intense than before. The Krex raiders had launched a major assault, and human casualties were pouring in faster than Dr. Grant and her assistants could treat them. The medical facility had expanded into adjacent buildings, and corridors were lined with wounded soldiers, waiting their turn for what the Zephyrians now understood was primitive surgical intervention. What disturbed Veltar most was how the wounded humans behaved while waiting. Instead of the quiet suffering or unconsciousness that would be normal for any injured Zephyrian, these soldiers talked and joked with each other. Some were helping treat others who were more severely wounded. Private Ben Collins sat against a wall with a bullet hole through his shoulder, calmly field-stripping his weapon, while blood soaked through his bandages. Dr. Grant emerged from the surgical area, wiping blood from her hands. She spotted Collins and called him over for treatment. The young soldier stood up, checked his weapon, and walked calmly to the treatment table. Veltar noticed that Collins had been wounded for over 20 minutes, yet showed no signs of shock or system failure that would be inevitable for other species. The examination revealed that the bullet had passed completely through Collins's shoulder, damaging muscle and probably nicking bone. For a Zephyrian, such an injury would require immediate regenerative treatment and several days of recovery. Collins asked if Dr. Grant could patch him up quickly so he could return to his unit before they missed him. Dr. Grant began cleaning the wound with antiseptic chemicals. Collins winced slightly but continued discussing the tactical situation with other wounded soldiers. She probed the bullet channel to check for foreign debris, then began suturing the entry and exit wounds with thread. The entire procedure took less than 15 minutes, and Collins was walking back toward the front lines with his arm in a simple sling. Theva pulled at Veltar's robes and pointed toward another treatment area where something even more shocking was taking place. Sergeant Amy Phillips had been brought in with shrapnel embedded in her thigh, dangerously close to major blood vessels. Instead of waiting for Dr. Grant to become available, Phillips had obtained surgical tools and was performing the extraction herself. The human soldier had torn her uniform to expose the wound and was using a mirror to guide her movements as she worked. She made careful incisions to expose the metal fragment, then used forceps to grip and remove it. Blood flowed freely, but Phillips maintained steady pressure with gauze while continuing the procedure. Other wounded soldiers offered encouragement and assistance but treated the self-surgery as completely normal. Noxon started hyperventilating at the sight. The concept of deliberately cutting into one's own body was so alien that his mind could not process it properly. Veltar had to support his colleague while Phillips finished treating herself and moved on to help other wounded soldiers. The most traumatic experience came when Captain Ryan Brooks was carried in with a sucking chest wound. The injury had punctured. His lung and air was escaping into his chest cavity with each breath. For any Zephyrian, such damage would result in immediate system shutdown, while regenerative processes took over. Brooks remained conscious and alert throughout his transport and treatment. Dr. Grant quickly assessed the injury and explained that she would need to insert a chest tube to drain the air and re-expand the collapsed lung. She offered Brooks pain medication, but he refused, stating that he needed to remain alert to coordinate defensive positions via radio. Veltar could not believe what he was hearing. The procedure required Dr. Grant to make an incision between Brooks's ribs and insert a plastic tube directly into his chest cavity. Without anesthesia, Brooks gritted his teeth and continued speaking into his radio while she worked. He issued tactical orders and called for artillery support, while a human surgeon was literally cutting holes in his body. The sight was too much for several Zephyrian healers. Kessery fled the facility making distressed sounds while two junior medics collapsed from psychological shock. Veltar found himself struggling to maintain composure as he watched Brooks calmly discussing military strategy while undergoing major surgery. The breaking point came when Private Danny Foster was brought in with his right leg completely crushed by falling debris. The limb was mangled beyond any possibility of repair, with bone fragments protruding through skin and muscle tissue hanging in shreds. Even Dr. Grant's primitive surgical techniques could not save the destroyed leg. Veltar expected to finally see something resembling rational medical practice. Surely the humans would remove the ruined limb and begin whatever regenerative process their species used for regrowth. Instead, Dr. Grant began preparing instruments for what she called amputation. She was going to cut the leg off and leave Brooks permanently disabled. The procedure itself was the most horrifying thing Veltar had ever witnessed. Dr. Grant used what appeared to be a mechanical saw to cut through Foster's thigh bone above the damaged area. The sound of metal teeth grinding through living bone echoed through the facility, while Foster remained conscious and aware throughout the entire process. What made the experience truly unbearable was Foster's behavior during the amputation. Instead of screaming or losing consciousness from trauma, the young soldier was telling jokes and stories to keep his squadmates entertained. He seemed more concerned about maintaining morale than about losing a limb permanently. Foster asked Dr. Grant to save a particular piece of shrapnel from his leg as a souvenir. He wanted to make a necklace from the metal that had ended his infantry career. The casual way he discussed his permanent disability while it was being inflicted was beyond anything in Zephyrian experience. Veltar stumbled out of the medical facility and collapsed on the ground outside. His respiratory system was failing, and his vision was blurring from what humans would recognize as a severe panic attack. The other surviving Zephyrian healers gathered around him in similar states of psychological distress. Noxon was repeating, over and over, that it was not possible for living beings to endure such trauma. Thyva had retreated into catatonic silence and would not respond to any stimulus. The junior healers who had fled earlier were found huddled in the shuttle, making distressed sounds and rocking back and forth. The concept that intelligent beings could not only survive but remain functional during procedures that would kill or permanently traumatize any Zephyrian was breaking their understanding of biology itself. These humans were not just primitive in their medical techniques, they were fundamentally different in ways that challenged everything the galactic medical community believed about life and consciousness. As explosions continued in the distance, and more wounded humans arrived for treatment, Veltar realized that his team was witnessing something that would require completely new categories of medical and psychological analysis. The humans were not just surviving impossible trauma, they were using it as motivation to continue fighting. The Zephyrian healers retreated to their ship to try to process what they had seen, but the images of humans calmly enduring procedures that would be considered torture by galactic standards continued to haunt them. They had come to help primitive aliens, and instead discovered a species that redefined the very concepts of pain endurance and survival instinct. The roar of engines announced the arrival of the first medical transport. Veltar and his team positioned themselves near Dr. Grant's workspace, expecting to observe briefly before taking over with their superior healing technology. The aircraft landed hard, sending dust and debris swirling through the medical facility. Human soldiers jumped out carrying their wounded comrade on a stretcher. Sergeant Alex Carter lay unconscious on the metal stretcher. His uniform was shredded and soaked with red blood. Jagged pieces of metal protruded from his chest and abdomen, while his left arm hung at an unnatural angle with bone visible through torn flesh. To Veltar's eyes, the human appeared to be dying, if not already dead. Dr. Grant moved immediately to the patient's side. Instead of reaching for regeneration equipment, she grabbed what appeared to be a cutting tool. Veltar stepped forward, expecting to see her begin basic stabilization before his team took over. What happened next made every Zephyrian in the room freeze in shock. Dr. Grant began cutting the soldier's uniform away with swift, precise movements. Then she picked up a metal instrument and began probing the wounds. She pushed the tool deeper into Carter's chest, searching for shrapnel fragments. Blood flowed more freely as she worked, and the human soldier's vital signs fluctuated wildly on the monitoring equipment. Noxon grabbed Veltar's arm and whispered urgently that the human healer was making the wounds worse. Thyva started forward to intervene but stopped when Dr. Grant spoke calmly to her human assistants about blood pressure and internal bleeding. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she continued what appeared to be deliberate mutilation. Dr. Grant located a large piece of shrapnel embedded near Carter's heart. Instead of using bioregeneration to dissolve and absorb the foreign object, she gripped it with metal forceps and began working it free. The fragment was buried deep, and she had to cut additional tissue to create access. Carter's body convulsed as the metal was extracted and fresh blood poured from the expanded wound. Veltar felt nauseous watching the procedure. In Zephyrian medicine, foreign objects were simply absorbed by regenerating tissue or dissolved by specialized bioacids. The idea of cutting deeper to remove something was completely alien to their healing philosophy, yet Dr. Grant continued with apparent confidence in her brutal methods. The human medic called for assistance, and 2 soldiers held Carter steady while she worked on his damaged arm. The limb was barely attached, with bone fragments visible through torn muscle. Any reasonable healer would simply remove the ruined appendage and regenerate a new one. Instead, Dr. Grant began the shocking process of trying to rebuild what was already destroyed. She started by cleaning the wound with chemicals that would be toxic to most galactic species. The smell of the antiseptic made Thyva gag and stumble backward. Dr. Grant then began the horrifying process of manually repositioning bone fragments. She used metal pins to hold pieces together, while her assistants maintained pressure on bleeding vessels. The sound of more aircraft approaching indicated additional casualties were arriving. Veltar was still trying to process what he had witnessed when soldiers carried in Corporal Maria Rodriguez. Her right leg was bent at impossible angles with white bone protruding through the skin in multiple places. The sight made Noxon sit down heavily as his natural color faded. Dr. Grant glanced at the new patient and called for her surgical tools. She explained to her assistants that they would need to perform immediate reduction of the compound fracture. Veltar assumed this meant they would finally see proper medical technique involving regeneration, or at least amputation, followed by regrowth. What happened next violated every principle of healing the Zephyrians had ever learned. Dr. Grant positioned herself over Rodriguez's shattered leg and began applying controlled force to the broken bones. She was deliberately breaking the leg further. The sound of bone grinding against bone filled the medical facility, while Rodriguez remained conscious and aware throughout the procedure. Thiva collapsed onto a nearby chair, making small distressed sounds. The human was not only conscious during what appeared to be torture, but was actually speaking to Dr. Grant about her condition. Rodriguez asked about her squad and whether they had completed their mission. She showed no signs of the psychological shock that would incapacitate any Zephyrian experiencing similar trauma. Dr. Grant continued repositioning bone fragments with mechanical precision. She aligned the pieces carefully, then secured them with metal rods that she inserted directly through Rodriguez's flesh. The Zephyrian healers watched in mounting horror as the human medic essentially rebuilt the soldier's leg using primitive, mechanical techniques. The most disturbing aspect was not just the brutal nature of the procedures, but the casual way everyone involved treated them as normal. Dr. Grant worked with steady concentration while her assistants anticipated her needs. Without being asked, the wounded soldiers remained conscious and alert, discussing tactical situations between waves of obvious agony. Veltar finally found his voice and asked Dr. Grant why she was not using regenerative healing techniques. She looked puzzled by the question and explained that humans do not regenerate damaged tissue. They heal by growing scar tissue over wounds and setting broken bones so they fuse back together. The process took weeks or months and left permanent changes to the body. The concept was so alien that Veltar struggled to understand. Dr. Grant showed him old scars on her own hands from previous injuries. The marks were permanent reminders of damage that had never been truly healed. In Zephyrian physiology, such scars would be impossible because regeneration restored perfect original form. More casualties arrived in rapid succession. Veltar watched Dr. Grant and her team work on soldier after soldier, using techniques that seemed designed to cause additional trauma. They cut open bodies to reach damaged organs. They broke bones to set them properly. They used toxic chemicals to prevent infection, and metal objects to hold body parts together. Each procedure that would take Zephyrian healers minutes with bioregeneration required hours of careful manual work by the humans. Yet somehow the primitive techniques worked. Soldiers who should have died from their injuries were stabilized and began the slow process of human healing. By the end of the first treatment session, 3 Zephyrian healers had fainted from shock, and the remaining team members were struggling with nausea and disorientation. They had come expecting to demonstrate superior medical technology to grateful primitive aliens. Instead, they had witnessed what appeared to be systematic torture being performed by healers who seemed completely immune to the suffering they were causing. Veltar retreated to the Zephyrian shuttle with his traumatized team. They needed time to process what they had seen and decide how to proceed. The humans had achieved results through methods that violated every principle of civilized medicine, yet their patients were surviving injuries that would have challenged even advanced Zephyrian techniques. As the shuttle lifted off to return to Serenity's Hope, Veltar looked back at the human medical facility. Dr. Grant was already preparing for the next wave of casualties with the same calm efficiency she had shown throughout the day. The human capacity to inflict and endure trauma in service of healing was beyond anything in Zephyrian experience or imagination. The sleek silver ship drifted through space like a gentle giant among the stars. Its hull gleamed with soft blue lights that pulsed in rhythm with some alien heartbeat. Inside the medical vessel, Serenity's Hope, Chief Medical Coordinator Veltar adjusted his flowing robes and checked the bioscanners one final time. His species, the Zephyrians, had been the galaxy's premier healers for over 3,000 years. Their bodies could regenerate from almost any wound within hours, and their medical technology could restore life to beings that other species would consider beyond saving. Today marked a special occasion. The Galactic Medical Coalition had received reports of a new species called humans who had recently joined the galactic community. These humans were apparently engaged in some kind of military conflict on one of their colony worlds, and the coalition decided this would be perfect opportunity to study primitive healing methods while offering superior Zephyrian medical assistance. Veltar examined the preliminary data about human physiology with growing confusion. The creatures seemed remarkably fragile, with no natural regenerative abilities and internal organs that appeared vulnerable to the slightest damage. Their bones were solid calcium structures that would break under pressure rather than bend and reform like proper skeletal systems. Most puzzling of all, humans seemed to heal through some kind of slow tissue replacement process that could take weeks or even months. The ship's communications officer, a young Zephyrian named Kesseri, approached Veltar with obvious excitement. The humans had agreed to allow medical observation during their current conflict with hostile raiders. Veltar nodded approvingly. This would give his team excellent opportunity to demonstrate proper healing techniques while studying how such a primitive species had managed to survive long enough to develop space travel. As Serenity's Hope entered orbit around the human colony, world of New Terra, Veltar could see the signs of conflict below. Smoke rose from several locations across the main continent, and the ship's sensors detected energy weapon discharges and explosive detonations. The Zephyrian medical team gathered in the observation lounge to get their first look at the species they would be helping. The shuttle that came to transport them down to the surface was a crude boxy affair that rattled and shook during atmospheric entry. Veltar found himself gripping his seat as the human pilot seemed to take unnecessary risks during the descent. When they finally landed at what the humans called a forward operating base, Veltar was surprised to see how hastily constructed everything appeared. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison met them at the landing pad. He was a tall human with short brown hair and tired eyes that seemed much older than his apparent age. His uniform showed signs of recent combat, and Veltar noticed several small tears in the fabric that might indicate recent injuries. The human's movements were stiff and careful, as though he was experiencing some kind of pain. Morrison led the Zephyrian team through the base, explaining the current tactical situation. The colony was under attack by Krex raiders who were known throughout the galaxy for their brutal efficiency. The humans had been fighting for 6 days straight, and casualties were mounting. Morrison spoke about the situation with calm professionalism, but Veltar could sense underlying tension in the human's voice. They arrived at the medical facility, which was little more than a reinforced bunker with basic equipment. Veltar was shocked by the primitive conditions. The Zephyrians were accustomed to sterile healing chambers filled with advanced bioregeneration equipment. This human facility looked more like a maintenance shop than a proper medical center. Dr. Lisa Grant emerged from the facility to greet them. She was a woman of medium height with blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her hands were stained with what appeared to be blood, and she wore a white coat that had seen better days. When she shook hands with Veltar, he noticed her. Grip was firm and her palms were calloused from manual work. Dr. Grant began explaining human anatomy, while distant explosions provided an ominous soundtrack. She showed them basic charts of human internal systems, and Veltar struggled to hide his amazement at how vulnerable everything seemed. Human hearts were single organs that would stop functioning if damaged. Their brains were protected by only thin bone that could be cracked by impact. Most shocking of all, humans apparently bled to death if they lost too much of their red circulatory fluid. The Zephyrian junior healers, Noxon and Thyva, exchanged worried glances as Dr. Grant continued her briefing. How had such fragile creatures survived their own evolution, let alone developed the technology to travel between stars? Veltar asked about human regenerative capabilities, and was stunned to learn that humans possessed virtually none. A severed limb would remain severed. Damaged organs would stay damaged unless surgically repaired. Even minor wounds could become infected and kill the patient if not properly treated. Dr. Grant seemed puzzled by their questions about regeneration. She explained that human medicine focused on preventing death and restoring function rather than growing new body parts. The concept seemed almost barbarically primitive to the Zephyrian healers, who could regrow entire organs in a matter of hours. Morrison received a communication through his earpiece, and his expression became more serious. More wounded were incoming, from the front lines. Dr. Grant immediately began preparing her equipment while Morrison explained that this would give the Zephyrians perfect opportunity to observe human medical techniques in action. Veltar felt confident that his team would be able to demonstrate proper healing methods and save lives that human medicine might fail to preserve. The Zephyrians had brought portable bioregeneration units that could heal virtually any injury. These primitive humans would surely be grateful for superior medical assistance from their more advanced galactic neighbors. As the sound of approaching aircraft grew louder, Dr. Grant made final preparations. She laid out rows of metal instruments that looked more like tools than medical devices. Veltar noticed that many of them appeared designed for cutting rather than healing. The human medical facility felt more like a workshop where broken machines might be repaired rather than a place where living beings received care. The first casualties would arrive within minutes, and Veltar prepared himself to witness what he expected would be crude attempts at primitive healing, followed by demonstrations of proper Zephyrian medical techniques. He had no idea that he was about to witness something that would shake his understanding of medicine biology and the very nature of survival itself.